This is Chapter 2 of The Three Whys of the Russian Revolution. Chapter 2. Why did the Bolsheviks triumph? The second emina of the Russian Revolution is why the Bolsheviks won. During and immediately after the October 1917 revolution, the event was generally perceived as a classic coup d'etat, rather than a popular revolution, and the Bolsheviks' victory was attributed not to their support popular, but to their superior organization and greater ruthlessness. This interpretation, formulated by participants and eyewitnesses, dominated Western historical scholarship for half a century. Interestingly enough, it received tacit support from both Lenin and Trotsky, neither of whom ever claimed, as I am able to determine from their voluminous writings, that the Bolsheviks emerged victorious because they had won the masses behind them. Trotsky wrote in his History of the Russian Revolution that 25,000 or 30,000 at the most took part in the events of October in Petrograd, in the city of 2 million, and a country of some 150 million. Lenin himself had unconcealed contempt for the masses and their ability to do anything beyond surviving. I do not know whether he had read Vilfredo, Pareto, or Antonio Mosca, but he certainly turned their face in political elites, and this is the following from one of Lenin's writings dating before 1917. In times of revolution, there is not enough to discern that the will of majority. No one must be stronger, that decisive moment, in the decisive place, and win. Beginning with the medieval peasant war in Germany until 1905, we have seen countless instances of how the better organized, more conscious, better armed minority imposed its will on the majority and conquered it. These are remarkable words from the self-styled Marxist revolutionary, but the arguments make sense, given that the Bolsheviks' constituency at the time was quite small, even among workers. We know that in late 1917, only slightly more than 5% of Russia's industrial workers belonged to the Communist Party, in a country in which industrial workers represented only 1 to 1.5% of the population. It was thus unspoken precipitation of the Bolshevik leaders, and the explicit one of the earlier generation historians, that October 1917 was a prevrot, an overthrow, rather than a revolution, an action accomplished by a better organized, more conscious, better armed minority, which imposed its will on the majority and conquered it. In other words, coup d'etat. In the 1930s, eager to acquire the credit of its alleged role in the October events, Stalin began to talk increasingly of the role of the party in winning the October Revolution, a view he imposed on the Soviet historical profession. But after his death, because Stalin became unsavory and the party wanted to disassociate itself from him, the emphasis was largely shifted increasingly to the population at large. By the 1960s, communist historians began to stress that the alleged role of the popular masses, or German Volksmassen, in the Bolshevik triumph. This theme was picked up by the younger generation of Western historians in the 1960s, a era of détente, who, for various reasons I have alluded, including a discuss with America's role in Vietnam and its allegedly proactive pursuit of the Cold War, felt in step with the Soviet historical profession. They too came to stress the popular involvement in the events of October, and argue that far from imposing their will on the people, Bolsheviks had been forced into action by them, except for a less adultery tone in regard to certain classics of the Marxism-Leninism and certain respect for Western scholarly manners. Not always, however, observed, the works of these revisionists hardly differed in substance from those of their Soviet counterparts. Let me turn to the origins and the character of the Bolshevik Party. Despite its name, derived from the Russian Bolsheviki, meaning more or greater, before 1917, the Bolsheviks were the smallest of the three main Russian radical parties. Most of the time, they had fewer followers in their social democratic rows than Mensheviks, and many fewer than the socialist revolutionaries. Their membership was heavily Great Russian. Statistics of the Fifth Congress of the Social Democratic Party, which met in 1907, and when the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks were still partners, 78.3% of the Bolshevik candidates came from Great Russian provinces. Among the Mensheviks, the proportion of Great Russians was less than half the number, 34%, and the majority consisting of Georgians, Jews, and other ethnic minorities. The party preserved the Great Russian makeup throughout its history. Thus, in the elections to the Constituent Assembly held in 1917, the bulk of the Bolsheviks' vote came from the Great Russian provinces. And during the Civil War, it was the Great Russian Center that provided the Soviet regime with the bulk of manpower. Referring to those facts, the Russian emigre historian N.N. Glavin observed that the strongest support for the Bolsheviks came from the regions before 1861 had the highest incidence of serfdom. The theoretical basis of the Bolshevik Party was Lenin's belief, also quite un-Marxist, that the working class itself was not revolutionary. He reaches a conclusion on the basis of his own experience with labor in St. Petersburg during the mid-1890s, the only period in his life that he had direct contact with the so-called proletariat. In observing the behavior of Russian as well as Western European workers, he concluded that left to their own devices, workers were incapable of progressing beyond trade unionism. That is, organizations dedicated to extracting the maximal economic concessions from the capitalist class while leaving the capitalist class system intact. From evidence it was possible to draw to practical inferences. One, the revolution was unrealistic objective, and the socialists should concentrate on helping labor secure better economic conditions, expecting to gain some time in the future throughout the ballot box rather than the barricade. This was the trend which came to prevail in the European socialist movements in the late 19th century following the emergence of Bernsteinism, a reformist within the German social democracy. But for Lenin, whom the revolution was an end in itself, this was no answer. He concluded that if workers were not revolutionary, the revolution had to be brought to them from the outside. This necessarily implied that the bearers of the revolution would not be rank-and-file workers, since they were poisoned by the baggage of accommodation, but by full-time, professional revolutionaries. Here are Lenin's observations on the subject, which the modern ear have remarkably a fascist ring. No single class in history has attained mastery unless it has produced political leaders capable of organizing and leading it. It is necessary to prepare men who devote to the revolution not only their free evenings, but their entire lives. This tenet had a variety of ramifications, but it meant, above all, that people who led the revolution could not be workers, because workers could not devote their entire lives to political work. After all, they had to earn a living. So if they happened to be workers originally, they had to join the movement they required to become party apparatchiks. In 1900, after suffering a severe psychological crisis brought on by the spread of Bernstein's ideas to the Russian social democratic movement, Lenin declared the labor movement separate from the social democracy inevitably returns bourgeoisie. This sentiment subverted the very essence of Marxism, to which Lenin pledged undeviating loyalty. According to Marx, the evolution of capitalism would inevitably lead to pauperization of the proletariat, and then just as inevitably its radicalization. It is interesting that Benito Mussolini arrived at the identical judgment 10 years later, before the outbreak of the First World War. Mussolini had been the closest analog to Lenin in the European socialist movement and been equally revolutionary and anti-reformist. He was the Lenin of the Italian Socialist Party, was different that, whereas Mussolini managed to rally behind him a revolutionary majority and expel the reformers. In Russia, Lenin found himself the leading minority and forced to break away from the social democratic establishment. Unfortunately, it's not possible to ascertain whether Mussolini arrived at this point independently or under the influence of Lenin. We cannot determine whether or not he had met Lenin during their common exile in Switzerland. Mussolini one cryptically remarked, "Lenin knew me better than I knew myself." I suspect that their ideas of political elitism, futurism, as well as ethnic and social extermination were so much in the air pre-First World War Europe that it was not necessary to seek them for better sources. In the early years of the 20th century, Lenin resolved that he had to form a novel political party which would indicate revolutionary socialism in the working class and concurrently prepare itself for the seizure of power at the opportune moment. The moment was linked in his mind with the general European war. Postcard to his mistress, Inessa Armen, sent in July 1914, days or possibly even hours before the war had been declared. He wrote, in his awkward English, "Best greetings for the commencing revolution in Russia." Apparently he concluded from the experience of the Russo-Japanese war that the carnage would radicalize the masses, especially in his own country, and make the revolution all but inevitable. Incidentally, the future Italian fascists entertained similar hopes. Mussolini, like Lenin, believed that left to themselves, workers were pacifistic and eager to compromise. For a reason, he attached a greater importance to war as a catalyst of revolution. There was a particular anti-democratic reactionary element in Bolshevism which promoted some to deny that it was socialist, even if it was not clear precisely what it was. The concept of totalitarianism had not yet been invented, and no one could anticipate that Lenin's party was the persecutor of a new type of political organization that would be emulated by the mass-based dictators of both the internationalist left-wing and nationalist right-wing varieties. The party which Lenin forged and led was not really a party in the customary sense of the word. It was more of an order, in the sense which Hitler called his National Socialist Party Ein Orden, bound by the members' unshakable loyalty to their leader and to one another, but subject to no other principle and responsibility for its constituency. Genuine political parties strive to enlarge their membership, whereas some pseudo-parties, the Bolshevik one first and the fascist and Nazi ones later, were exclusive. They treated membership as a privilege, restricting it to persons who met a certain ideological as well as class or racial criteria. Elements regarded as unworthy were purged. The purpose of the totalitarian parties, for which Bolshevism provided the model, was not to become the government, but to manipulate the government from behind the scenes. The Brotherhood of the Elect was designed to stand outside the body politic, even as they directed its every move. Once in power, the new rulers created a dual state, in which the ordinary government institutions with their ministries and judiciary served as a facade concealing the real authority, which was the hands of the party. Mussolini aptly called his fascist party the capillary organization of a political body. This prototype in respect to was Lenin's Bolshevik organization. Typically, totalitarian parties did not compete with rival parties, but liquidated them. In July 1992, I happened to be in Moscow working archives in which had been made available for engineers when the trial of the Communist Party got underway. I was requested by the Russian Constitutional Court to give an opinion on whether CPSU was a political party or not, and the question was asked in connection to the charge had been to as outlined by President Yeltsin the previous year. In response, I said that indeed the CPSU neither nor had been a party in any accepted sense, but rather, as a prosecution claimed a special mechanism for seizing control of the state. The court sustained the president's decree, even as it hedged on drawing from the appropriate conclusions. The Bolshevik Party was small in early 1917, probably because of the defections during the relatively calm and prosperous Stolypin era period, partly because of the rather savage persecution of the police after the first outbreak of the First World War, which it opposed. The political police had thoroughly penetrated the party with its agents, sufficient to say that the chief spokesman of the Bolshevik Party in the Duma worked for the Okhrana, the Imperial Security Police. So did the editor Pravda, Lenin's principal organ. All of Lenin's article in Pravda published before July 1940, which is closed, were vetted by the police. Notwithstanding their minuscule membership and police penetration, the Bolsheviks enjoyed some important advantages over their rivals. Lenin treated politics as warfare. Of course, all Marxists did in a sense, to that Marxist politics means class war. But the others did not take this dictum quite as literally as Lenin, whereas they have thought of it as ordinary conflict, and he alone saw it as a purpose for conquering and annihilating all rivals. By annihilation, he meant not merely eliminating them as competitors, but physically exterminating them. Such a view of politics gave, of course, Lenin great advantages in the struggle for power. Once power was gained, however, the adversary was conquered, which view provided no guidance for running a society. The Bolsheviks felt no qualms into restoring merciless terror. The communist historical establishment, among those in Western scholars, share this general outlook, have maintained that early Bolshevik terror would irrevocable, avoidable response to the counter-revolutionary activities of the regime's opposition. This argument was never persuasive, given that the Cheka, the secret police, the main agency of the Red Terror, was established in December 1917, before there was any organized resistance to the new regime. Now he had fine confirmation of these doubts. In a document released by which would call the Central Party Archive, handwritten by Lenin, calls for its urgent unleashing of terror, requests that meeting be held. Among the participants, he mentions Felix Dzerzhinsky, the future head of the political police, in order to discuss its realization. The document is undated, and the Russian archives, for the reasons best known to them, assign it to 1920. Internal evidence, as well as letter on letterhead, which is no written, however, leave no doubt that it was ordained around the spring or summer of 1918. It confirms that the Red Terror was not a reluctant response to the actions of the others, but a perfect means to design the nip in the bud of any resistance to the dictatorship. Both Lenin and Dzerzhinsky later claimed that the Cheka and its terror saved the revolution. This is correct, but only by revolution one means Lenin's party. Lenin saw himself as the commander-in-chief of an organization committed to permanent political warfare. He unquestionably excelled this particular pursuit, including the chapter of Russia under Bolshevik regime. I maintain that he was never an outstanding statesman. He had few constructive ideas, but he was one of the great conquerors of world history, a man who vanquished his own country in a way no one could before him had attempted. The rival parties, the socialists to some extent, the liberals were populist, believing in innate wisdom of the Russian people. They were not prepared to fight, and they lost out to a politician to whom a struggle was a normal occupation, and peace a mere breathing spell for war. Lenin wanted power, and this may sound self-evident. After all, every politician is assumed to lust for power. But deep down, Lenin's rivals did not want it. I see parallels in today's Russia. Yeltsin wants to rule, his rivals fear the responsibility of power, preferring to criticize from the sidelines. In 1917, the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks were quite content to let the bourgeoisie provisional government to govern while they kept up a steady barrage of denunciation and criticism. But Lenin wanted so much more. There was a famous incident in April 1917 which came to figuratively in Soviet Hagovli. Lenin had just returned to Russia from Switzerland, and the followers he lined up with the Mensheviks in expressing satisfaction with an arrangement under which the socialists, through Soviets, controlled the bourgeoisie, and prevented it from trading from the democratic pact without themselves assuming the responsibility for administrating the country. All the Russian Conference of Soviets held in April, the Menshevik Ikora Shafili said there is no party in Russia willing to assume responsibilities governed, to which Lenin from his Ch.2 there is indeed no party was prepared to stake that claim. This hunger for power more than compensated for the relatively small following of the Bolsheviks. Another advantage of Lenin's derived from the fact that he did not care about Russia. He cared about Germany and England in the sense that for him, as a revolutionary, they were key countries. Russia he viewed as nothing as more than a stepping stone in the global upheaval. A backward country populated mainly by an uncouth rural bourgeoisie in the shape of self-sufficient middle peasants and kulaks, such a country would not be made for world revolution. At best, it would serve as a set-off of the powder keg abroad. In his view, Russia was the weak link in the chain world of imperialism, snapping at which had unleashed upheavals in the heart of Europe. It was profound professional tragedy for him. His expectations in this respect had met, and revolution remained confined to Russia and her colonies. Because he did not care about his country, Lenin was prepared to promise everybody whatever they wanted without giving much thought to the future. The peasants wanted private land for their communes. Let them take it. Eventually, all land will be confiscated and collected anyway. Until then, looting the loot will win over, at least neutralize the peasantry. The workers demand to run the factory, even though workers' control is a detestable anarcho-signalist slogan. There is no harm in granting them their desires for the time being. Once industries have been nationalized and subjected to the general economic plan of production, worker control will advantage of itself. The soldiers clamor for peace. Give them peace. When the proletarian dictatorship is firmly in power, they will be duly mobilized for the global civil war. The national minorities call for independence. By all means, they have to ask. The right of national self-determination, including separating statehood, is guaranteed with a tacit understanding if exercised, it will be overruled by superior right of proletarian self-determination. This purely tactical approach to all the problems was an enormous boon, because no other country in Russia was prepared to engage in such demagoguery. Of course, when the promissory notes were presented for later on, Lenin had to default by alienating those who passively or actively helped him become control, forcing him into a totalitarian regime which had not been in his full-on intention. And finally, Lenin was uniquely unscrupulous. He was prepared to collaborate on a tactical basis with absolutely anybody who served his interests, not only at home but also abroad. There's not any question he took money from Imperial Germany, even while Russia and Germany were at war. We have plenty of documents dating from 1917 to 1918 proving this fact. The Germans tried to win over similar traders in France and England without success. However, they exceeded beyond their wildest dreams in Russia. This was, to them, a matter of great importance, because once the Schlieffen plan had failed, Germany desperately needed to knock Russia out of the war in order to concentrate all her forces on the Western Front. It was her one remaining hope of the winning war against a grand alliance of democratic countries of vastly superior human and material resources. Lenin, the only European socialist leader to openly call for his country's defeat, found collaboration with Germany mutually advantaged. He accepted sizable sums of money after his return to Russia to restart his shattered party organizations and revive his press. No other group in Russia was prepared to concert the enemy, and therefore none could compete with him effectively once the struggle for power got underway. Germs of subsidies did not stop in October 1917. They continued well in 1918 into the moment of Germany's capitulation. In June 1918, the Russian embassy in Moscow wired Berlin that to keep the Bolsheviks in power it needed 3 million marks a month. The sum was allocated to use in bribe Latvian and other Bolshevik and neutral forces. I found that the former Central Party archives revealing a document that had been carefully concealed for over 70 years. It is a cable from Lenin to his ambassador in Berlin, I. Bierzin, dated August 1918, instructing him to spare no expense in spreading communist propaganda at once. The Berliners would send more money, he assured them, if the scum delays complained to me formally. The provisional government found quickly, just as Nicholas II had foundered quickly. The Tsar refused to transfer more authority to the Duma, not because he enjoyed power, he hated all ceremony, but because he believed the politicians were running it were not capable of governing. They were intellectuals used to debating and legislating, but lacked administrative experience. Indeed, as it turned out, the political stance of the provisional government and its partner, the Petrograd Soviet, were replete with contradictions, and thus far the Soviet pronounced the war imperialistic while, the same breath, insisting that it pursued until victory. Even a literate worker or soldier could understand this made no sense. And while exhorting the country to fight, the Soviet passed all kinds of laws that subverted the war effort, notably the infamous Order No. 1, which effectively deprived officers of authority over their men and politicized the armed forces. By the end of spring 1917, with this conqueror's instinct, Lenin realized the incurable weakness of the provisional government and felt confident that the slightest would topple it. As it turned out, he underestimated not of its strength and its popularity. He tried 3 times in April, June, and July to bring it down by means of street riots. In July, he nearly succeeded, but inexplicably lost at his nerve at a critical moment. He had the government on the run, paralyzed, and part of the power is for the asking, but he faltered. The splendor almost caused the destruction of the Bolshevik Party, and the Minister of Justice released some of the documents at his disposal showing Lenin's dealings with the Germans. When the information reached them, the infuriated garrison troops dispersed the Bolsheviks and their supporters. Lenin had got into hiding, and for 3.5 critical months, what preceded the October coup, he lived in concealment, first in Russia, then in Finland, then again in Russia. The October coup was therefore planned, managed by associates including Trotsky, who adopted a more cautious tactic, calling for a physical force being concealed, a smokescreen of Soviet pseudo-legality. Lenin had a habit of attributing to his opponents his own qualities, that is, expecting to do what he would do in similar circumstances. After July had failed, he was convinced Kerensky would have him and associates arrested and shot, because that it is what he, Lenin, would have done in his shoes. And even though he had personally managed to elude Kerensky's police, he was resigned to the fact that he had been his own defeated, and his whole Bolshevik experiment was over and done with. He was quite emotional in his assessment. He settled with Zianoev, his loyal father, across the Finnish border in a fielded hut, and devoted his free summer days swimming up the lessons of failed revolution for the benefit of future generations of revolutionaries. And by then, suddenly and unexpectedly, events began to turn his way, and by September, the situation was ripe for yet another revolutionary attempt. The occurrences helped turn the situation in favor of the Bolsheviks. On the failure of June 1917 offensive, Kerensky took over the Ministry of War, and in July thought it'd be the best way to rally the country behind his government to waking the flagging patriotic sentiments by winning an impressive military victory, just as the French Revolutionary armies had done in 1792. For the lessons of the French Revolution had been well studied by the Russian radicals like Kerensky, and were never far from their mind. They observed the unfolding events in Russia as the prism of revolutionary France, with disastrous consequences. The June offensive in time ran out of steam, and the Russian army rapidly disintegrated. The second factor which aided the Bolsheviks was the failure of the government to convene the Constituent Assembly, to which it had been solemnly committed on assuming authority in March. The Assembly alone would have given Russia a legitimate authority. Undoubtedly, had elections been held while the provisional government was still in office, the majority of the seats would have been won by the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the Bolsheviks' rival. Had this occurred, it would have been next to impossible for the Bolsheviks to claim that they alone truly represented the people. Yet the government procrastinated because it had always more urgent things to attend to. This gave invaluable ammunition to the Bolsheviks, enabling them to claim the government feared elections, and only the transfer of power to the Soviets, accomplished by them, the Bolsheviks, would ensure timely elections to the Assembly. The third incident, and the one that contributed most directly to the success of the October coup, was the so-called Krolinoff affair, which complicated episode of the revolution is grossly misinterpreting much of historical literature. Krolinoff is constantly depicted as a counter-revolutionary general set on overthrowing the democratic government and assuming dictatorial powers. This version is false and owes its widespread acceptance to rather unusual fact that it served the interests of two mortal enemies, the provisional government and the Bolsheviks. In the space available, I am going to deal with the details of this incident. Sufficient to say it was resulted from a bullshit intrigue on the part of Kerensky, who, feeling the ground giving way under him, wanted to regain support in the Soviet and at the same time rid himself of a general whom he came to see as a dangerous rival. Kerensky and Kornilov, whom Kerensky had appointed as the commander of the Russian army after the abortive July Revolution, was a simple-minded combat officer, a kind of Russian George Patton, highly popular with the troops and intensely patriotic but lacking in political skills. He watched with dismay the collapse of both the state and his beloved army. Convinced that he was the candidate of all the conservative forces bent on a military coup, Kerensky lured him into sending troops to Petrograd to help suppress another expected Bolshevik rising. After Kornilov had carried out his orders, Kerensky accused him of seeking capture of the capital city, overthrow the government, and take power in his own hands. There's no evidence as the Kornilov plot, but there was plenty of Kerensky's duplicity. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister's conflict with the commanding general did not restore his political fortunes. On the contrary, it handed the Bolsheviks a superb argument for a counter-revolutionary that was indeed brewing. Alienated from Kerensky and the armed forces, which alone could save him, as they did in July from another Bolshevik attempt, in October he sought with the armies against the putschists, which would turn a deaf ear to his pleas. Although their fortunes had dramatically improved in 1917, September, most Bolsheviks with memories of July debacle fresh in mind still hesitated to act. They did well in Soviet elections that month, campaigning on the slogan "All Powers to the Soviets," but they remained a minority nationwide. The armed forces in particular, even though they had no more heart for fighting, disliked the Bolsheviks, viewing them as a party of turncoats. The peasantry stood loyally behind the socialist revolutionaries. Nevertheless, Lenin's instinct told him the time to strike again was fast approaching. From his hideaway, he badgered his associates to move. The provisional government was weak, he insisted it will lack the courage to resist. On one occasion, he wrote that the Bolsheviks promised the soldiers immediate peace to peasants' land, and they would win them over and establish a government that no one would ever overthrow. In one reads these letters of Lenin, 4 altogether, and they were not intended for publication, and were made public only years later. One becomes aware of how little Lenin trusted in the forces of history. Unless the Bolsheviks struck promptly, victory would elude him. To delay his death, he wrote, to a historian not blinded by the faith in historical inevitability. Lenin's extortions to empathize to what extent October 1917 was a calculated risk. For it was inevitable. What difference did it make? One struck immediately rather than later. Yet it mattered enormously. Lenin was afraid that the war might end or the provisional government abandon Petrograd to Germans. He also feared that the government would preempt him by holding elections to the Constitutional Assembly. Indeed, the government announced in August that the elections to the Constitutional Assembly would take place in November. And Lenin, well aware he could not win a majority, wanted it to be in control before the nation had expressed its will. His colleague demurred. They feared the time on the Bolshevik sides, whereas fiasco like July putsch would finish them off for good. They preferred to act in a pseudo-legal fashion by convening a Congress of Soviets to assume power, but only one representing those Soviets in the legal party had majorities. I say pseudo-legal because the Bolsheviks, like any party, had no authority to convene a National Congress of Soviets. This was exclusive prerogative of the Central Executive Committee of Soviets, dominated by the Socialist Revolutionaries Mensheviks. But the Russians never had much respect for legal niceties, and even less into the turmoil of revolution and tepid civil war. Lenin rejected the strategy. He did not trust even an illegally convened Soviet Congress packed with his adherents to hand him power. To wait for such a Congress was sheer idiocy for treason. He wrote, "No revolution waited for majorities. Hold your Congress if you insist. But first, seize power and present it with a fait accompli. When the party's Central Committee met in secret in session during the night of October 10th, Lenin slipped into town to take part in its deliberations. He insisted that the putsch was carried out, and Kamenev and Zamenhof opposed his proposal most brutally, but others had doubt. Subsequently, Kamenev gave an interview to the Menshevik newspaper in which he revealed that this agreement, Lenin, in a white fury, called him and Zamenhof traitors to the revolution. With these words, he demonstrated that he was on a revolution. How can one betray a revolution? Imagine how anyone can be accused of betraying a revolution. A coup d'etat, on the other hand, can indeed be betrayed. The minutes of the Central Committee meeting for October 10th, published by the Communists in 1927, are silent about the decision to carry out the putsch, in which took place 2 weeks later. Even though other subjects were amply discussed, reference to the most important matter of all of it is missing. I had assumed it had been deliberately deleted by its editors in order to maintain a fiction that October's was a popular revolution, and said so in the Russian Revolution. However, in 1992, I had a chance to see the original handwritten protocols of the October 10th to 11th meeting. The information was missing there as well, and the reason for omission could lie Lenin's obsessive secretness and the fear that if committed to the paper, the information would leak out, jeopardizing the whole risky undertaking. Of course, we do not need documentary evidence to know revolutions were adopted, for we know what followed. The Bolshevik tactic was to goad the government by all kinds of provocative moves into active measures against themselves, and then claim a counter-revolution was underway, and allege the defense of the revolution against its enemies. The Bolsheviks would seize power by occupying strategic points throughout the capital city. This was to occur during the night preceding the opening session of the Second Congress of Soviets, scheduled for October 25th. The next day, Congress would ratify the abolition of the provisional government and transfer all the power to the Soviets. The battle plan was a compromise between Lenin's proposal of immediate power seizure and his associates' preference for legal camouflage. The manner in which the strategy was implemented holds considerable interest because the combination of deception, surgically employed force, and a sham legality provided a model for more than what totalitarian leader would successfully emulate. The event which helped the Bolsheviks to set their plan in motion was an anticipated German attack on the city of Petrograd. In the second week of October, the Germans seized from the Russians several islands of the Gulf of Riga. It was widely believed this naval operation was preparatory to an assault to Petrograd. Kerensky, acting on advice of his military, contemplated moving the capital to Moscow. The Socialists and Soviet reacted with the usual combination of paranoia and hysteria, accusing the government of wanting to abandon Red Petrograd to the enemy. They proposed creating a Soviet military force capable of defending the city from the expected German attack. The Bolsheviks at first opposed this motion because they thought it would strengthen the provisional government, but they reversed themselves and supported it. They realized the only force that the Soviet could count on were their armed units directed by their military organization and that would provide a Soviet fig leaf for their coup. With the Menshevik and Socialist revolutionary help, they now acquired a mechanism for taking power. For the Military Revolutionary Committee, or MIKREVCOM, was nothing but a front for their own military organization. It probably was no accident that the meeting of the Bolshevik Central Committee, which decided on the power seizure, took place on the day after the Soviet had voted to create the MIKREVCOM. During the 2 weeks that preceded projected coup, acting in the tacit consent of the Soviet, the Bolsheviks sent commissars to all the military units stationed in Petrograd and vicinity, instructing them to ignore orders from the government unless countersigned by the Military Revolutionary Committee. It seemed no one objected to this maneuver, which undermined the government's authority over its troops and transferred them into the hands of Lenin's lieutenants. It had the effect of neutralizing garrisons 240,000 men strong, the only force capable of thwarting Bolshevik designs. The world-shaking events that took place on the night of October 24th were anticlimactic of how happenings labeled historical turn out to be more than an empty ceremonial occasions, while those that affect the destinies of millions attract in their day scarcely any attentional. Lenin was standing when his critical measures were implemented. He was incurable coward who took cover whenever there was any risk to him personally, as he exhorted his followers to battle. Trotsky was far more courageous and very much in evidence during these critical days, haranguing the crowds, taunting the government, and helping in so other ways stage for their coup. So was Podolsky, Nevsky, and other commanders. During the night October 24th, responding to some half-hearted positive measures by the government, armed units of the Military Revolutionary Committee took over the capital city's key installations: the post office, the telegram, central telephone bureau, the headquarters of the government military command. It was a bloodless coup carried out while the Petrograd was asleep and unaware what was taking place. Government sceneries guarding these installations were relieved and told to go home. The military headquarters was taken over the same manner as Bolshevik officers walked under guard into Mikhailovsky Palace and simply replaced those officiating there. There was no resistance. As Lenin would say afterwards, taking power in Petrograd was easy as picking up a feather. The next day, the only one willing to go in the government was namely the Winter Palace. Here huddled the ministers, defended by a battalion of women, a platoon of war invalids, a few bicyclists, and some military cadets. The building was never stormed. The much-reported photograph of column workers, the Red Guards, is still fake, from Eisenstein's movie October, filmed in 1927, with the help of some extras. Several attempts to storm the palace were made, but as they soon ran to fire, the attackers retreated. Eventually, the women bicyclists and invalids left the Winter Palace, because Kerensky, who had gone to the front in a borrowed American car to get assistance, was nowhere in sight. When most of the defenders had departed, the attackers climbed through the open windows and the back doors. They were not opposed because the ministers told the cadets who remained to the end, prepared to fight, that wanted no bloodshed. The ministers meekly surrender, and push was over. Still, Lenin was his usual casual self, and cautious. He took power not only on behalf of the Bolshevik Party, the words of the Bolshevik Party did not appear anywhere in the early documents, but on behalf of the Soviet, and he imitated what he wanted to have democratic transitional government. The word socialism must not appear in the announcement proclaiming the overthrow of the provisional government, which he drafted in the early hours of October 25th. Had written originally, "Der Stranjevut, Socialism," long live socialism. But then, second thoughts and crossed these words because he did not want to alarm anybody. No one had any idea that anything important had transpired. It seemed merely a shift of dual power to unity power under the stronger partner. The Soviet assumed full responsibility. The next day, the cafes were filled, the opera reopened, and life returned to normal. It seemed to be just one of those government crises that had been occurring over the frequency since the Tsar had abdicated. The Bolsheviks contributed to this profession by calling theirs also a provisional government. It was widely believed as soon as the Constituent Assembly met, the Bolshevik government would yield fully power. And the new masters did wrong to dispel this mirage. The Bolsheviks did hold elections on the Constituent Assembly, but when it transpired, they gained only 24% of the vote, and the new government would be run by socialist revolutionaries. They dispersed the assembly. Afterward, they dropped the adjacent provisional title from the government and set themselves up as a one-party regime, except it was later in early 1918, they gave a splinter socialist revolutionary group several commissar portfolios was exclusively open to the members of the Bolshevik Party. In Petrograd's outrages, the Bolsheviks were enormously aided by the illusions and fears of the democratic socialists, who between them had garnered nearly 3/4 of the national vote and on the face of it enjoyed massive popular backing. Had they chosen to act, the socialists knew well that the Bolsheviks were up to it. In spite of their democratic professions, they were planning to establish a one-party dictatorship. They were inhibited from acting by the fear of any attempt to liquidate Bolsheviks coup that would lead to destruction of the socialist movement and accompany the whole triumph of the counter-revolution. At the time of the Bolshevik takeover, the Menshevik paper Novyaya Zhizn wrote, "It is essential above else to take into account the tragic effect of the violent liquidation of the Bolshevik coup will at the same time result inevitably in the liquidation of all the conquests of the Russian Revolution." Throughout the Revolution and the Civil War, the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolution criticized the Bolsheviks, but their critical moments they supported them against their opponents. This was particularly the case in 1919 when they sided with the Reds against the Whites, sabotaged the anti-Bolshevik armed struggle. More than once, the workers and soldiers would come to them and offer to resist the Bolsheviks. The Socialist Revolution and the Mensheviks would refuse them support on the grounds that such resistance would help the forces of reaction. They further justified their unwillingness to confront the new regime on any other but the verbal level. The agreement at the time was working for democracy. Being a minority party facing the unprecedented problems of creating a social society, the Bolsheviks have no choice sooner or later to invite them into the government. Thus motivated, they ended up utterly passive, and in the end, except for those who emigrated, they all perished. This cursory survey serves to a coup in October 1917 was a classic coup d'etat accomplished without mass support. It was supplementalist seizure of nerve centers in the modern state, carried out under false slogans to neutralize the population. The true purpose was to be revealed only after new claimants were power firmly to saddle. In the coup d'etat, the Technique of Revolution, published in 1932, on the mechanisms of modern seizure of power, based his analysis of what happened in Russia. Then he also witnessed similar process take place in Italy under Mussolini and drew parallels. The population at large offered little resistance at such a time, and such resistance would have made all the difference because they believed the new regime could not last. The so-called Soviet government was seen as much a crazy utopians who would be swept away from the scene as soon as they had appeared. When Bolshevik policies began to affect the average interests of workers and peasants, former through liquidations of worker control and independent trade unions, and the latter through ruthless food exactions, they rebelled. The years 1920 to 21 witnessed more resistance to the new regime, as historian Vladimir Brovkin has demonstrated. The true civil war started after only the Whites' armies had been crushed. It was a war pitting millions of peasants against millions of Red Army troops, in which hundreds of thousands perished. But by then it was too late. The mutinous sailors of Kronstadt, the striking workers of Petrograd, and the peasant partisans of Siberia had no chance of defeating the government in the Tsarist days, the rebels led by Stepan Razin or Emilian Pugachev. Still, the acquisition of power in this manner had its own logic, of which Bolsheviks were only dimly aware. By imposing on the country minority rule, refusing to consider yielding or even sharing power, they laid the foundations for totalitarianism. Lenin had generally believed that once the counter-revolution had been smashed, popular democracy would triumph. But the counter-revolution turned out to be not only the thin layer of disposed landowners, bourgeoisie, and officials, but the great majority of the nation. As long as he was unwilling to give up power, he had no choice but to resort to exceedingly repressive regime. His erratic behavior in 1921-1922 can be in large measure explained by the dismay he felt by so many things going wrong. As he once put it, the driver streets in the car, in one direction the car goes, God knows where, because he refused to surrender the steering wheel. Willy-nilly created conditions which made inevitable the rise to power of a personal dictator who turned out to be more ruthless than he.